It should be starting now. And welcome. So officially, this is, as you can see here, we swapped the lectures. This is actually our final lecture when it comes to new topics. The next lecture will be actually course wrap up that is focused on the exam itself. So we will do the written exam. You already know about assignment number 2. For those of you who maybe were not here last time, it's actually like a two-page assignment. You have to use examples from your mother tongue, and you have to give one example of analogical change, any, hypercorrection, folk etymology, blending, whatever. One example for each type of borrowing, need, prestige, and negative evaluation, and one example of semantic change, again, any type. So you give one example in 1 and 3, and you give 3 examples in 2. There's a sample on your course website. You can download it, and when you delete the sample text, you also can use this as a template for your own assignment, which should be submitted, uploaded to the folder, or if you are scared of doing this because there are evil people who delete stuff from that Google Drive, then you can also send it by email, or actually you should maybe do both, upload it and just in case send it by email. So that's the deadline. And I want to share with you something that was a piece of news from last year, but I only found out about it yesterday. No, I forgot when. Last week. Yeah, last week on Wednesday. Noam Chomsky has never heard of Baby Yoda, and has no thoughts about memes. Interesting, right? Interesting. But now that we've tackled this, the lecture that you're going to hear, and that is also being recorded, is one of the final chapters in Lai Campbell's Historical Linguistics book, the Introduction to Historical Linguistics. And it's actually in your schedule, it's listed as grammaticalization, and this is because I use that term since I was a student, but that's grammaticalization is subtype of grammatical change. So actually today's lecture is about grammatical change, and it's the last lecture. Last week we talked about contact-induced change and how English was shaped by various language contexts throughout its history, and how it actually influenced changes in grammar of English. And English actually turns out is the most, let's say, the most spectacular change that has ever happened in the history of language change, probably. But before we talk about grammatical change, let's remind ourselves once more of what change is. When you type in change into Google Photos, Google Images, actually, Google Photos is private, what you get for the term change is something like this. So we are not talking about this, leaving your past behind and taking a new road into the future. What we are talking about is, for example, this. I recorded the song versus I played the record. Greece will probably default on its debt by 2022. The default file on my computer just got deleted. Adrian converted to Pastafarianism. Adrian is a convert to Pastafarianism. So what we see here is an example of change. So you have verbs and nouns that have completely different pronunciation patterns. I mean, they sound similar, of course, they all come from the same, let's say, root. But what is different is, of course, their stress pattern. So you have the verb pervert, but the noun is pervert. you have the verb transport, but the noun is transport. The verb is present, but the noun is present. You can contract, but you sign a contract. You can import, but it's an instance of import. Then, with these last two, there are opposing opinions in different dictionaries. Should it be dispute versus dispute, or it's simply dispute, and whether there is a difference between direct and direct. But of course, you know that for the last one, there is a difference between direct and direct. But on the other hand, in some other words, there's no such alteration. Convoy, convoy. Preface, preface. So this is based on something that Campbell talks about, but he did not come up with himself. He took it from Sherman's research from 1975. The question is, how did it happen? What is language change? How actually it happens? So the change, of course, is the change between patterns. But how did it happen? And it happened in stages. So this is actually language change. Language change is not a sudden event. I forgot to emphasize this in the previous lectures. So it's actually a staged process. And there are actually, according to Campbell, at least 3 stages. And most linguists actually agree that these are the 3 stages of language change. So the first stage is, of course, the bare minimum for any change. Does anybody, want to hazard a guess what could be the first stage in a language change? Something new has to appear, right? What would you call it? Okay, it's innovation. So the first is, of course, a new development, an innovation. There's a new rule that appears in a language, or any language, actually. So in this case, with convert and convert, you form the verb by moving the stress of the noun, which is on the first syllable, to the second syllable, which indicates the verb. So that's the rule. In this case, it's a simple shift of stress. So from the first to the second syllable. Then this innovation, this new rule, which applies to 1 or maybe 2 verbs, spreads to more verbs. The rule applies to more and more words, or in some situations, it's not more and more words. In case of, let's say, pragmatic patterns, new developments in, the language use, it changes, it appears in more contexts. And then it's not only about more words or more context. Then the last stage is that out of the group of innovators, you remember the Coleridge circle, the passive progressive construction. So they used it themselves a lot. They used it in all the verbs that they wanted to make passive and progressive. But then what happens is that more and more speakers use it, and not more and more speakers only within the same social class, but among different social classes and in more registers and styles. And that is actually change. These stages have shorter names. The first one is called actuation. The second one is called extension or actualization. And the last one is called diffusion or transmission. The first two are together called the innovation. So one single rule that applies to one word is probably not an innovation. But if you have one pattern across more words, then it's an innovation. So one single fluke or weirdness in language is not a change. That's an exception probably. But if that spreads to more words or contexts, then you have the innovation. And then when it spreads, when the innovation spreads or diffuses to more speakers, you have either a finished change when everybody accepts it, or ongoing change if a group of speakers, but not the whole language community, accepts this innovation. And virtually all, although Campbell says theoretically really all changes, can be thought of in this way. So this is how it happens. This is language change. This is the innovation that spreads and diffuses. The other question is why this happened. And this is what I already mentioned. One swallow doth not a summer make. So one change in the grammar of an individual is not a change in a language. So you have to understand that a change is something that spreads. So a language change is a change across different contexts and across different speakers. But on the other hand, a theory of language change must also provide an account for why this happens. So although the innovation happens, there's a new rule. It may or may not diffuse, but if you want to have a theory of why this happens, you have to be able to capture every single new rule, whether other speakers accept it and whether it starts appearing in other contexts and in other words. So why does language change? So the explanation that Campbell gives, and this is like the final chapter of his whole book, and that's why this is also the final lecture, is that there are fundamentally 4 explanations for language change. And this is, for example, something that can appear as the final question in the written exam. What are the 4 standard explanations for language change, or what are the 4 types of explanations for language change? Elaborate. So the 4 are typological explanations. We didn't discuss them in details because they assume that you know a lot about language typology, which we don't know. We discussed the second one, external factors, a lot. So borrowing and language contact is another possible explanation. The third explanation, which is now very interesting and is still being hotly debated, is acquisition. So, so explanations based on language acquisition, some call it even generative explanations. And finally, there are pragmatic explanations based on language use. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples for each, which you can then use in your written exam. So typological explanations are based on the fact that languages like to be systematic. And languages like symmetry in everything that is within the language system. So the way to put it more formally is that languages like to be, unmarked. So all the features in the language should be symmetric and nothing should be marked. Everything should be in a way unmarked. So the typical example of this is symmetrical consonant system. Or, for example, in other typological, examples, you, for example, have languages where you see historical changes that lead to all modifiers on the same side of the head. So in English, we are still not there, but it is very rarely these days that you can put an adjective behind the head noun. So Secretary General. Normally you have to put the adjective in front of it, although historically that was not always the case. So the best example is symmetrical consonant system, and actually English, just like for virtually all changes, English is a perfect example. So the phonemic inventory of English, Old English, looked like this. So you had f, p, t, f, s, and sh, so fricatives, but when it comes to plosives, you had b and d, and that was it. There was no v, there was no j, no the. And what happened is that for every voiceless fricative and plosive, you suddenly got the voiced counterpart. So f got v, p already had b, t already had d, but th got d, s got z, sh got j. So plosives and fricatives all now have voiced and voiceless counterparts. And that's, for example, a typical explanation of typological reasons for language change. So if you're asked in the written exam what are the 4 explanations for language change, elaborate, you can say there are 4, you list them, and then say when typological explanation, typological reasons for language change imply that languages like symmetrical systems and move toward unmarked types. The best example is the phonemic inventory of Old English versus present-day English, where all voiceless fricatives got their voiced counterparts, just like plosives, and yeah, that's it. When it comes to the second type, these are external factors. We discussed this in details. So it's the transfer of one language or dialect to another language. So you have borrowing, but you also have, in addition to borrowing, you can also have imposition. Borrowing is when the recipient speaker is the agent. So in Serbian, we decide to borrow English because English is cool, and we decide to borrow its vocabulary or some pragmatic features. But sometimes there's another possibility. And that is, for example, if you have a dominant culture, that's historically what happened. This is not common these days. You have, for example, a dominant culture and a dominant language where they simply say you should speak like this. You should use this and that word. You should not use your own words. So imposition is the opposite of borrowing, when you are forced by the source language speakers to actually pronounce something in a particular way. So this is not something that is popular to debate these days. But for example, this happened in Russia, in the Soviet Union, where many republics of the former USSR did not speak Russian, but some terms were imposed upon these languages because of the Russian administration. This source and recipient is, of course, defined in terms of psycholinguistic dominance. There are also, of course, other possible borrowing, so you don't have to borrow vocabulary. You can borrow. We discussed this in details. Now let's go to the third type. This is actually the coolest of them all. That's the generative explanation for language change. It's some people call it acquisition-based model of language change. This is really cool because the generative view, as you have listed here, implies that language is inside speakers' minds. So it does not exist independently. So every time a child is born, every time the child starts growing up and acquiring language, you create from scratch the new rules for the language to which you are exposed. And this creates what they call discontinuity. So in other words, when children create a new set of rules that describes what they hear, is actually the cause of language change. So parents have a certain set of rules that underlines what we call primary linguistic data. So what children hear, the primary linguistic data, is generated by rules that parents created. But children try to deconstruct these rules and create their own rules which explain what they hear, and those mistakes that they make are actually future changes. This is called the Z or Z model. Let me explain it with minions. Do you like minions? I hope you do. So you have parents, Mr. and Mrs. Minion. And here's the kid, baby Minion. Now, let's say that you watched the Despicable Me movies, and you know that these cute creatures have their own language. There's even a dictionary and basic syntax of that language on the internet. So parents could say something like poka, tatata, balatu, and that's grammar 1. And this is this primary linguistic data set that kids are listening to. And it creates these sentences. Poka, tatata, balatu. That's actually from the real movie. So kids listen to this and they may decide that actually what's happening in the language of their parents is poka, tatata, balatu. So they may decide that ka is not really a separate word, that it's actually part of, that it's actually a grammatical morpheme attached to po. And tu is again the suffix that is added to bala. So if you think about it, what you end up with is almost the same. Poka, tatata, balatu, poka, tatata, balatu. But the systems that create this are completely different. So on the surface, you have more or less the same structure, but the system that provides this is completely different. And this, according to generative linguists, is what causes language change. And here you see, as we were drawing the arrows, like grammar 1 produces output 1, babies hear output 1, create new grammar, and this grammar creates output 2, which is identical when you listen to it, but it's actually different on the inside. That's actually the Z or Z model, because when you draw it like this, you get the letter Z. So in this approach, the key to language change is, of course, acquisition. So acquisition is what causes the language change, because kids, babies, they create a new syntax based on what they hear. And sometimes they can create a new syntax based on the input that their parents are giving them, although their parents actually created a different set of rules when they were babies themselves. And the final fourth type of explanation for language change is the so-called functionalist approach. So it's simply about language use. Depending on who you're addressing, who you're talking to, who you're writing to, what social status you are and who you're talking to, and you know, depending on the social network of your communicative situation, you make choices. And these choices, when you decide to change something in your language system to accommodate to this audience, is what causes the change. So this is completely different from generative approach. This is actually approach which says that if you think about it, that's not kids who are causing the change. This is the adults, not children, because through their constant interaction or negotiation, adults create new structures, and those new choices that are made become fixed, grammaticalized, and actually there are some changes which can only be explained by that, as well as there are changes which can be only explained through the Z model. So that's why we say that there is no single cause of language change, but 4 different causes or 4 different explanations for language change. So the best example on how adults and language users create the language change through pragmatic explanation is the word go, or actually grammaticalized form of the verb to go. So in the first stage of the English development of the word to go, you had something like, I'm going to fetch water from the river. So this literally means I will move my body to the river and fetch the water from the river. So going literally means going. You're moving. So you will walk there, you will get the water from the river. In those early stages, and we have that recorded in historical corpora, usually letters, you cannot say, there are no examples of something like, I'm going to get better, or he's going to get killed if he continues doing this. This is completely impossible. But then, in the second stage, going to has this new inferred meaning of future, let's say, time reference. So I'm going to fetch water from the river doesn't mean I'm going to walk and get the water from the river. It means simply in the future, I will make sure we get water from the river. And then suddenly I'm going to get better. He's going to get himself killed. These things become possible. So it means in the future, I will get better. So these are actually the stages and the explanations for language change. And this is something that you can now, let's say, use to fill in the gaps that I maybe left open inadvertently, because instead of 13, we only have 9 lectures. So I had to squeeze a lot into these 9 lectures. Normally, this would have been a much more casual, relaxed course that spans over 12 or 13 lectures. So with those 4 explanations and the 3 stages of language change, we can actually look at last type of change that we so far haven't analyzed, and that's syntactic change. So we dealt with semantic change, we dealt with borrowing, we dealt with phonological change. The only thing that we haven't discussed, context-induced change, what we haven't dealt is syntactic change. Of course, some of these things overlap. Borrowing and context can lead to syntactic change, but they can also maybe just result in new vocabulary. The problem and the reason why we will not have a lot of, you will not have a lot of questions on this in the written exam is that this whole chapter in Campbell starts with this paragraph. Let me read it for you. The study of grammatical syntactic change is currently an extremely active area of historical linguistics, so it's a hot topic. Nevertheless, there has been no generally recognized approach to the treatment of syntactic change such as there is for sound change. While there have been some excellent studies in the 19th century, syntactic change was very often not represented or present only superficially in the textbooks on historical syntax. So one of the reasons for this is that also, as you heard in the previous lecture, there were certain assumptions about syntactic change that prevented people from going deeper. It was assumed that syntax simply changes because you borrow a lot of words. And it was also in many cases, like in English, inconvenient and politically and scientifically suicidal to go against the assumptions that held for centuries, such as that the Celts were not relevant for the development of English syntax. The good news is, despite this lack of consensus on how to treat syntactic change, fortunately, there are only 3 mechanisms of syntactic change, and they are universally accepted. What is not universally accepted is how to explain the causes of this, how to explain the transmission, diffusion, how to classify something as an ongoing syntactic change, or how to finalize change, etc. So those 3 mechanisms are some things that you already know about. The first mechanism of syntactic change is reanalysis. The second one is extension. And the third one is borrowing. And you actually know them because we dealt with extension and reanalysis when we were talking about analogical change, and borrowing was a separate topic. Now, Campbell mentions that in some textbooks, but that's, according to Campbell and most other authors, a debated and hotly contested topic, grammaticalization could be the 4th mechanism. The reason why it's controversial is that when you will see it in, let's say, 20 minutes, when we get to grammaticalization, grammaticalization is fundamentally just a subtype of reanalysis. In most cases, grammaticalization is simply reanalysis. Let me then actually start with reanalysis because it's the most common mechanism of syntactic change, and let me give you examples. So very rarely in the written exam you can get a question such as what is reanalysis as a mechanism of syntactic change. Provide an example. Reanalysis, as you know from analogical change, is simply what it really, what it's called. It's reanalysis of the underlying structure. What's important is that this new analysis, reanalysis, does not modify the surface structure. So the surface manifestation is the same. but the underlying structure, like constituency, grammatical categories, etc., they get reanalyzed. Surface manifestation like morphological marking, like case markers or word order, they stay the same. On the other hand, extension is the opposite. The extension is change in the surface manifestation, but there's no change in the underlying structure. You get a new suffix. You get a new prefix or something like that. Or a new pattern develops, but it doesn't violate grammatical rules in your language. Borrowing, of course, we discussed it a lot, so we won't go in there. I will just list here what Campbell wrote, and this is a quite new book on historical linguistics, that syntactic borrowing, as you saw also from English, like ing, do support, etc. So syntactic borrowing is much more frequent, much more important than some scholars have thought in the past. There are some extremes that assume that everything that happens is due to borrowing. That's wrong, of course. No extreme is good. But actually, if you want to analyze syntactic borrowing, you can get scholarships throughout the world because more and more people are aware of the importance of syntactic borrowings and also pragmatic borrowings. So we didn't talk about them a lot, but I mentioned to you, for example, expletives and swear words in Norwegian that are taken from English, but are also changing slightly the syntax of Norwegian. And of course, the controversial fourth type, grammaticalization. It is also a hotly debated and researched topic, but it's not a new term. The term is more than a century old. It was coined by Antoine Meillet, I think, and he described it as the attribution of a grammatical character to formally independent word. The more recent definition is from Kuritovic, from 1965, that this is an increase of the range of a morpheme that advances from a lexical to a grammatical, or from a less grammatical to more grammatical. In all these examples, the four types of language syntactic change, so reanalysis, extension, borrowing, grammaticalization, the key concept is reanalysis. Of course, it's analysis, but done anew. We already discussed this, so no changes in the surface manifestation, only changes in the underlying structure. It's an old concept going back to 1977. So let me show you the example. In Middle English, you had a sentence such as, "It is better for me to slay myself than to be violated thus." It was by a woman who decided not to be raped. Instead, she killed herself. I forgot from which work of art it was taken. And in modern English, we still can understand it. We can actually still say it, although it sounds very archaic. It is better for me to slay myself than to be violated thus. The problem is, and we know this based on, let's say, questions in Middle English letters, questions in Middle English plays and poems, etc., that the structure of Middle English was not what you would expect. In modern English, you would say that the main part, it is, it is better. And then for me and to slay myself are complements of better. That was not the case in Middle English. In Middle English, this was the structure. It is better for me and then to slay myself than to be violated thus. Whereas in modern English, you say it is better, and then you have two, let's say, complements of better. For me to slay myself than to be violated thus. So you can actually paraphrase this as in modern English, for me to slay myself would be better than to be violated thus. In other words, for in Middle English and Modern English has a different underlying structure. So for was originally a preposition, but in Modern English, it became a complementizer, the term that you know from syntax, right? So the clause boundary, constituency within syntax, everything changed, and you got this new shift. But on the surface, you can still understand it. It's just that you will not analyze it the same way that Middle English native speakers would analyze it. So this is also a good example of that Z change, because this happened at one point where kids started to reinterpret for not as only as a preposition, but also as a complementizer, like a subordinator. Another change, which is really cool, and another example of the Z model of language change is, what babies can do to language comes from Finland, from Finnish. And Finland is cooler than you think, right? This is, of course, Kimi Räikkönen, a cool driver. So I will simply go through this very quickly. But it's really amazing what happened in Finnish, and this shows you again this reanalysis and its power. So this is from a study from 1977, and Timberlake, when he was analyzing Finnish participial clauses, noticed what we already know, what I told you, that every syntactic change usually implies reanalysis, how you understand underlying relationships. But also this reanalysis implies that you also have to do the actualization. You have to map out this reanalysis to other structures in your language. So this is what we also call extension. You have to reanalyze, but you also have to extend this reanalysis from, let's say, less to more marked context. So very briefly, what Timberlake claimed is that grammar determines the output, and learners, like in that Z model, learners of language formulate new grammar that produces the given output. But the new grammar does not have to be identical to the grammar of their parents. Sometimes, according to Timberlake, the given output, what they hear from their parents, can be produced by two different grammars. And what is in this case language change is simply a shift between those two grammars. And actualization is when most people in the language community accept these changes as norms. So he observed this change, for example, in Finnish participial clauses. Finnish is a terrible language to learn. Finnish objects, for example, do not appear only in one case. They can appear in three cases. Partitive case, sorry, when the clause is negative. Accusative, if the verb has an overt subject. And nominative, if the verb has no overt subject. That's a nightmare from a learner's perspective. So you have to change the case of the object depending on the polarity and the presence or absence of the subject. Really difficult, very complex, right? And what then Timberlake also analyzed is verbs of cognition. Think, for example. Verbs of cognition in Finnish are always followed by participial clauses. And in those participial clauses, the subject of the participle was in the same case as the object. So if, if the verb has no overt subject, then you would have the nominative. If there is an overt subject, accusative, or partitive if there's a negation. And in Old Finnish, when you look at it, this is exactly the case. I'm not going to pronounce Finnish. I will try to, pronounce it the way it's spelled. Sidan, whatever, Olewan. Just a second. I have a phone call. Okay, I thought that it was maybe something important from the faculty because the exam is happening, December examination period, but it's actually a top shop. No way, I'm not replying to you. Okay, so this is partitive case because it's a negative clause. Then accusative, because there's an overt subject, and the nominative case because there's no overt subject. So the underlining subject of the subordinate clause, so does one not think this to be a sin? He promised the congregation to be long-lasting. It's observed the gods and the gift of God to be lacking. Are raised to become objects of the main clause, and underlying subjects, they all follow these rules that they should be in the partitive, accusative, or nominative case. But then when you look at modern Finnish, this partitive, nominative, and accusative complexity is gone. So in all these contexts, you have the genitive case. The underlying subject of the subordinate clause, it's marked in bold here, is always genitive, which suggests that it's not an object. So this is reanalysis. Notice, by the way, okay, sorry, I should go back here. So notice that in one of these instances, the suffix is n. This is really important. This n is the key. So the analysis happened because the accusative ending m and the ending n in genitive singular were merged. But not in plural and in pronouns. And of course, I'm not an expert in Finnish, and this example goes on for 5 pages in Campbell's book. But what it means is that one group became ambiguous. Active verbs with singular noun phrase subjects. So it was not clear whether it was genitive or it was accusative. And kids, when they were listening to this, created a new grammar, a grammar, with underlying genitives and individual rules for exceptions. And it worked. So they created a new grammar where this was all genitive and you have some exceptions to it, instead of a system which describes, no subject, present subject, partitive construction. That's very complex. This actually is simpler. You simply use the genitive and you have some exceptions. And this is a prime example of reanalysis. So originally, in mother and father minion, you had subject, object, and this object was extracted from the subordinate clause, and it had the same case that you would have if it was the subject of that subordinate clause. So it's very complex. It's hard, really hard to figure out that this is the actual rule, how you get this form. And this was, yeah, a rule that you extract the subject, make it an object, and then assign the case. The new grammar is completely different. I don't see, or actually not I, the baby minion, no longer sees this as the object which was extracted from the subject position. It simply sees it as a subject in the subordinate clause. So the baby created a new grammar, and this new grammar reanalyzes this object as a subject of the subordinate clause, and then applies the general rule that subject of a participle is always the genitive case, plus some exceptions. And subsequently, even the exceptions rules are lost, and that created the syntactic change. So this is the prime example of reanalysis. The last thing that we have to do is grammaticalization. So grammaticalization is controversial. We already did extension and borrowing. We don't have to go into that. You have examples when we talked about extension and borrowing. So the fourth type, the controversial type of syntactic change, is grammaticalization. Campbell says that it's maybe not even a real type of language of syntactic change, but a subtype of reanalysis. So let's understand why Campbell and many other people say that grammaticalization is really reanalysis. So grammaticalization, if you remember, is a historical unidirectional process where lexical items over time, in the course of time, acquire new status. Instead of free lexemes, they become grammatical morphosyntactic forms. So a lexical unit assumes a grammatical structure, or a less grammatical structure becomes a more grammatical structure or function. Or the example which I gave from Kirilovich, that it is the increase of the range of a morpheme from a lexical to grammatical, or from a less grammatical to more grammatical. So it's an old term. We mentioned it, goes back to 1912. But even in the 19th century, they mentioned something similar to grammaticalizations. And they didn't call it grammaticalization, but Bob, for example, wrote that philologists now admit that conjugations, declensions, etc., originally existed as distinct words joined together. And it all goes back to actually Darwin, that created this notion that single organisms join together into bigger organisms and change, and for example, functions of this small organism are retained, but in a modified way in a bigger organism. So for example, you know that in human cells, mitochondria are actually old bacteria that were assimilated by the bigger cell. So our cell in itself contains organelles, small, organs within the cell that were originally bacteria themselves. So, they attained new functions, but are no longer independent organisms. Now they function within a bigger human cell. So this actually applies to, everything, not only language, that you can make something function in a smaller set of, let's say, contexts and conditions. So the best example, in addition to, for example, the grammaticalization of the verb to go as a marker of future, is also, which I mentioned, so English going to or gonna. That's the best known example of grammaticalization because it involves a lexical word which became a marker of future time reference. French pas is actually the same thing. Of course, not future, but a negation. Pas originally was not a negation. It meant a step. How this developed into negation, I don't really know, but that's what happened in French. However, what I know is, for example, the example from German. Mann means a man. But man, if you speak German, you know that it's also indefinite pronoun. Man muss essen. It means in English it would be one must eat. So man, instead of, you know, meaning a masculine human being, means now any human being, and it's used as a pronoun. And of course, there are other examples from, you know, again, French, where letting humilemente, with a humble mind, became an adverb which means humbly. And for example, in Russian, ya is a plural suffix for bratya, like brothers, but it was originally a collective suffix, not a plural suffix. And in French, for example, the verb have is now used in as an auxiliary for future. It became a future suffix. That similar thing happened actually, but it was already a grammatical word. Will and shall, they were modal verbs, but they became markers of future again. So the general pattern, and this is why we say that this is reanalysis, is that you have a lexical item that you use in a particular context, and then you reanalyze it. That's why we think this is a type of reanalysis as a grammatical item. Or you have something that is less grammatical, but then you understand it as more grammatical. Or you have a free word, but then you reanalyze it as a clitic, suffix, or affix. So that's why this is considered reanalysis. So grammaticalization is fundamentally always reanalysis. There are some instances where reanalysis is also followed by phonological reduction. You know, you don't pronounce it the way that you would pronounce a lexical word. You know, there's no stress on clitics, for example. But all of this stems from reanalysis. So reanalysis also leads to loss of syntactic freedom, semantic bleaching, that you lose the specific meaning, but you use it in a grammatical meaning, or you you have some pragmatic inferencing. So fundamentally, the reason why it's controversial is that reanalysis always can be interpreted, grammaticalization can be interpreted as reanalysis plus actualization and extension. So let's go is originally let us go. So it was a clause with the object us and then a subordinate clause go. But it gets reanalyzed as let's, as, you know, like modal marker, and the verb phrase go. And the reason not the reason. The reason why, not the reason why it happens. We don't know why it happens. The reason why we know that it's reanalyzed as this is that you can hear native speakers say something like, don't, let's go. So in other words, the reason why grammaticalization is considered to be a subtype of reanalysis is that grammaticalization always involves reanalysis. But reanalysis doesn't always imply grammaticalization. So that's the logic. So if anybody asks you why is grammaticalization controversial as a subtype of syntactic change, it's simply because every grammaticalization is reanalysis, but not all instances of reanalysis are grammaticalization. So it has to be a subtype of reanalysis. When it comes to pragmatic inferencing, which I mentioned as a process that is also present in grammaticalization, that's, for example, exemplified by after and since. So after and since were originally used for temporal sequences, but now they're also used for causation. So in modern English, these original temporal conjunctions now also can be used as causal conjunctions. So, for example, after we heard the lecture, we felt greatly inspired. Probably not after this lecture, but this means because, right? Or the minute John joined us, things started to go wrong. That's because he joined us, things started to go wrong. So pragmatic inferencing is simply about understanding something which is originally in one meaning as having a broader, let's say, broader influence on the whole situation. So something that is simply about when happened is you infer that the sequence of events led to a particular effect. So you see this event as a cause of the outcome. So that's pragmatic inferencing, and you know, this also applies to conjunctions such as so not only after but also since, but I forgot to add examples of it. And with this I actually ran out of slides for today's lecture. So maybe we could have done the final exam today, but I didn't send you the sample and I don't have it in this in these slides. So I can maybe just tell you that this is the end of the lecture, but not of the course. That next week we will have the overview of written exam. And now I can stop recording and you can start asking me some questions that now that we have time, maybe, you know, some things that are related to the exam, to your assignments, or anything